The gates creaked as they opened. The iron was rusted, untouched for decades, as if time itself had welded them shut. The front lawn of the Newport Beach estate looked frozen in history. Overgrown hedges, sun-bleached flagstones, and a chipped mailbox that hadn't seen a letter in years. But what truly made the air feel heavier that day wasn't the decay. It was what waited behind the front door. A team of estate investigators, flanked by a legal representative and a historian, stepped inside with gloved hands and cameras rolling. They had clearance to document what had not been touched since John Wayne's death in 1979. No renovations, no auctions, no tours, just silence, waiting to be disturbed. The front hall smelled like old books and leather. A thin veil of dust coated everything, from the saddle-styled bar stools to a framed black-and-white photograph of Wayne with President Nixon. A pair of boots sat by the door, cracked and dry, like they'd been waiting for someone to come home. No one had. In the living room, sunlight struggled through heavy curtains. Antique furniture stood like monuments, surrounded by faded newspapers, unopened boxes, and film memorabilia now worth millions. On one wall hung an oil portrait of Wayne from his True Grit years, still proud, still watching. But even his stare couldn't explain the quiet tension in the air. Then came the study. It was sealed with a custom iron lock and 2 decades worth of caution tape. The investigators paused. This was it. The room even the estate attorneys had never entered. Inside, it was as if the Duke had stood up and simply walked away. A cigar still rested in a cracked ashtray. A typewriter sat mid-sentence. And on the wall, in a glass case, hung an old Winchester rifle. But none of that compared to what they found next. In the far corner, hidden behind a worn velvet curtain, was a steel safe, bolted to the foundation. Dusty, untouched, its dial stiff with age. And according to the registry, it had never been opened. The lead investigator looked around the room. "Are you sure this wasn't listed in the original inventory?" "No record," the estate lawyer replied, flipping through yellowed documents. The safe wasn't decorative. It was intentional. It had weight. And the moment the combination lock clicked, after 2 tries and a long-held breath, the door groaned open. What they saw inside stopped everyone cold. Stacks of files, private letters, envelopes marked confidential. And at the very back, a sealed brown package with a note taped on it. In John Wayne's unmistakable handwriting, it read, "Only to be opened when the last light fades." Everyone looked at each other. The cameras kept rolling. The silence was unbearable. For over 4 decades, people thought they knew everything about the Duke. His films, his politics, his patriotism. But this wasn't part of the script, because inside that vault was something that no one was ever supposed to see. And what it revealed would turn a Hollywood legend inside out. Sunlight fought through curtains onto a forgotten stagecoach model, its wooden wheels frozen mid-roll beneath a layer of dust. The room smelled of time, old paper, leather, and something else. Something dry and still, like an attic sealed too long. Each footstep on the creaking floorboards echoed through the halls, as if the house itself was adjusting to company it hadn't seen in over 40 years. John Wayne's estate didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. Like the moment he died, everything inside froze. Not a dish had been moved. Not a single photo frame had been turned. The dining table was still set with heavy silverware, its napkins yellowed and stiff. One investigator gently lifted a glass. Tiny flecks of dust scattered into the air like disturbed ash. Stacks of mail sat untouched inside a carved wooden box near the front door, all dated from the early 1980s. Catalogs, handwritten cards, a few unopened fan letters, faded ink, bled into envelopes that had long stopped seeking answers. In the corner of the parlor, a grandfather clock stood tall but silent. Its pendulum had stilled itself sometime in the past century, hands locked at 9:07, as if time simply gave up on the house. There were no signs of tampering, no scratch marks on locks, no broken glass. The alarm system, wired in during the early days of home security, had long since gone quiet. Still, nothing had been disturbed, not even the cobwebs in the corners. Everything was wrapped in plastic sheeting, tight and sealed like time capsules. Leather saddles, movie posters, boots from Stagecoach, and costume pieces, all preserved like museum pieces that no one ever came to see. A bronze statue of Wayne on horseback stood under a tarp, almost regal in its placement, untouched, unsmiling, unmoving. Through the hallway, past the den, the bedrooms painted a different picture. These were not showpieces. These were personal. His bathroom held the same cologne on the counter, hardened now to resin. A bar of soap sat in its dish, cracked and dry, waiting for a hand that would never return. In the master bedroom, a bathrobe still hung behind the door. It hadn't moved. Neither had the slippers below it. In his personal study, his desk remained cluttered with notes, yellow legal pads, and letters never mailed. On one notepad, a short phrase was scrawled in thick black ink. "They won't understand." No context, no signature, just that line. Bookshelves lined the walls, rows and rows of dusty Western novels, history books, military biographies. Some were underlined, dog-eared, heavily annotated. Wayne had clearly read them himself, not just displayed them. There was something intimate about those pages, almost like each underline was a quiet conversation he had with history. The kitchen was clean but dated. A fridge from the 70s still hummed. Inside, empty egg cartons and rusted shelves told their own story. This was a place that hadn't been lived in, but hadn't been cleared out either, like whoever left just didn't bother saying goodbye. One of the investigators paused near the back hallway, where the light didn't reach. The air was different here, cooler, heavier. At the end of the hallway stood a single wooden door, darker than the others. The doorknob was newer than it should have been, a fresh bronze color that didn't match the rest of the house. No one could remember it being part of the original estate blueprint. "Was this always here?" one of them asked. The estate attorney hesitated. "Not listed on any of the plans I have." The team moved closer. The door had no keyhole, no window, just a smooth, unmarked surface with faint smudges around the edges, as if someone had touched it recently. That's when they noticed the warmth. Unlike the rest of the house, which felt like a museum of the dead, this door radiated something else. Not heat exactly, but presence. The air near it wasn't stale, it moved. There was energy, subtle but impossible to ignore. No one spoke, they just stared. Because for all the dust and silence that filled John Wayne's forgotten estate, this one door didn't feel like it belonged to the past. It felt like it had been waiting, watching, and before anyone could reach for the handle, something shifted behind it. A whisper of motion, a faint creak from the other side, just enough to send a chill down the spine. In a house frozen in time, one thing had somehow stayed alive, and whatever it wasn't done yet. The drawer was built into the underside of John Wayne's personal writing desk, a thick oak piece with carved longhorns at the corners and brass handles worn smooth from use. It wasn't obvious at first. The wood grain concealed it, and it lacked any visible hardware. But one investigator, running their fingers along the edge, felt a shift, a click. The panel slid open with a soft pop, and out came a shallow drawer lined with green velvet. Inside sat a single sealed envelope, yellowed but crisp, untouched by decades of air. On the front, written in dark blue ink, was a name, J.W. Personal. They opened it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. What they found inside wasn't a printed document or a typed note. It was handwritten, 2 pages long. The first page began with a date, May 22nd, 1979, less than a month before John Wayne died. The content read like a codicil, a personal amendment to his official will. At first, it reiterated known points, leaving specific film memorabilia to museums, small sums to old friends, and a portion of property to various children. But then, midway through the second page, the tone shifted. It mentioned names that had never appeared in public records before. There was a note about no further financial obligation to Pilar, his third and final wife. Another line read, "Any attempt to contest these wishes should be considered against my honor and my peace." His words were clear, steady, and deliberate. To the investigators, this wasn't just paper. It was dynamite. This matched what was already controversial about the original will. John Wayne had left nothing to Pilar, despite their 20-year marriage. Not even the house she was living in at the time of his death. Meanwhile, some of his children received oddly specific amounts, like $10,000 here, $15,000 there. And then, buried in the estate breakdown, there was this: $30,000 to his secretary. Not a housekeeper, not a long-lost sibling, his secretary. The codicil only made things murkier. While it didn't directly explain why Pilar was cut out, it did repeat phrases like, "Those who truly stood beside me, and not all promises deserve reward." Sentences like that don't clarify. They implicate. They hint at betrayal, personal judgment, or unfinished business no one ever knew about. The estate attorney shook their head in disbelief. This changes everything. If this codicil is valid, it rewrites the distribution. But it also raises a disturbing question. Was this revision done with a clear mind, in full awareness? Or was it the work of someone else entirely? John Wayne had been battling stomach cancer. By May 1979, he was weak, in pain, and heavily medicated. The handwriting was steady, but was the decision, and more importantly, was he alone when he wrote this? Legal experts would later confirm that no such amendment had ever been filed through official probate. If this was real, it had been deliberately withheld. And if it wasn't, someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like it was. Then there was the letter, clipped to the back of the document. Not part of the will, but folded separately and unsigned. It simply read, "The ones you trust most are the ones who hold the knife." No name, no context, just that line. Everyone in the room was quiet. They knew what was coming next. If this document was authenticated, it would reopen a case many assumed was long dead. And if it wasn't, it might point to something darker: fabrication, manipulation, maybe even fraud. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why did the Duke cut out the woman at his deathbed, but include the secretary with $30,000? Was it loyalty? Was it revenge? Or was it a decision made by someone else's hand, not his own? If this codicil was real, it meant he changed his final wishes in secret. If it wasn't, it meant someone rewrote his legacy after he died. Either way, the truth was buried deeper than anyone expected, and the clock was now ticking to find out who buried it and why. The media picked it up first, quietly at first, almost like a rumor. One headline buried in the local section read, "Sealed will discovered in John Wayne's Newport Beach estate, 2025." But that small story exploded into a national frenzy within 48 hours. Because if it was true, if a second will or a hidden codicil had just been found more than 4 decades after the Duke's death, it meant one thing. John Wayne's legacy wasn't settled. It was just getting started. Following pressure from multiple family members, a court finally granted a renewed petition to unseal parts of the estate earlier in the year. There had long been whispers of missing documentation, unexplained exclusions, and decisions made that didn't match Wayne's public words. Now, in 2025, those whispers had finally grown loud enough to force the doors open. What no one expected, however, was the hidden drawer and the envelope inside. Once discovered, the newly surfaced documents were immediately sent to a private forensic lab in Los Angeles, not just for preservation, but to verify everything: ink age, paper source, writing style, and fingerprints. The process wasn't quick. It took weeks of analysis, chemical breakdowns, and ultraviolet scanning. Experts worked through every curve of every letter, comparing it to Wayne's known writings from his final years. The ink, consistent with a model of pen known to be manufactured between 1976 and 1980. The paper, sourced from a now-defunct stationer in Los Angeles, one that Wayne himself had used, according to old receipts. And the handwriting? A perfect match. Not forged, not shaky, not inconsistent with his known mental state in May 1979. Then came the fingerprints. Though smudged in areas, several were intact, matching John Wayne's known prints, archived from old military service records. But there were others, unknown, unmatched, some partial, but one full and clear. The lab flagged it immediately and passed it on to the investigators. Within 72 hours, they had a name. It wasn't Pilar, it wasn't a child, it wasn't a known employee. It was someone who had never been tied publicly to the Wayne estate before. But now, they were. The forensic timeline that unfolded painted a story far more complex than anyone had imagined. The codicil hadn't just been written, it had been hidden. The type of drawer it was found in didn't even exist in commercially sold desks. It was custom, likely installed to make it difficult to access. That drawer, according to a dated carpenter's invoice found in a box of receipts, was added to the desk just 3 weeks before Wayne's death. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Meanwhile, the family was in turmoil. Half of Wayne's heirs claimed the original will was valid and final. Others insisted the new discovery demanded legal recognition. Attorneys were preparing motions. Journalists were requesting access to the documents. And fans around the world were left with a single question: why had this stayed hidden for 46 years? As the analysis continued, a pattern began to emerge. One tied to property transfers made quietly in 1980, to accounts that hadn't been linked to the estate before. A paper trail was forming, one that began with a sealed will and now stretched across decades. But none of that compared to what came next. Because buried at the bottom of the analysis file, among the ink data and fiber tests, was one line from a document preservation specialist. It read, "This codicil appears to invalidate key portions of the original 1979 will." If that was true, if that line held up in court, it wouldn't just shift the inheritance. It would shift the very story that had been told about John Wayne since the day he died. And as legal experts began weighing in, they realized something even more disturbing. This document didn't just challenge the past, it threatened to erase it. The codicil had already stirred up enough dust to choke a courtroom. But buried deeper within the estate's original files, uncovered during a secondary sweep of Wayne's old filing cabinet, investigators found a small leather-bound folder labeled only with a number, 24601. It wasn't referenced in any official inventory, it wasn't listed in probate records, and it didn't match any prior catalogued estate documents. Inside were 5 additional pages, 4 typed, 1 handwritten, each appearing to be connected to the hidden will discovered in 2025. These weren't part of the original 1979 probate package. They had no legal seal, no witness signatures. But what they contained changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. The typed pages listed what were referred to as addendum directives. Legal language, yes, but vague and oddly formatted. 3 clauses stood out almost immediately. A numbered account in the Cayman Islands, designated for charitable cultural preservation. A full collection of signed paintings by Frederick Remington, willed to an unnamed Southwestern Heritage Center. And a line that simply read, "The personal footage archives are to be transferred without audit to the designated custodian." That last line set off every alarm. What personal footage? No one had ever heard of it. Wayne's film library was supposedly locked up in a studio vault and managed by his production company. This hinted at something else, something privately held and potentially explosive. Then there was the matter of the paintings. When estate analysts checked against insurance logs, they found a hole. Several original Remington works were missing from the last known inventory conducted in 1981. No record of sale, no report of theft, just gone. The clause regarding the offshore account raised even more questions. The term charitable cultural preservation was legally murky. Who determined the recipient? Who managed the transfer? And why offshore? A call to a now-defunct bank in the Caymans confirmed the account once existed, but was closed in 1983, just 4 years after Wayne's death. Some of these assets vanished, the estate's financial auditor said. Were they diverted while everyone slept? That's when the investigators began to widen their net. Not all of Wayne's children were close to him at the time of his death. At least 2 had been estranged for years. One, his eldest son, Michael, had publicly challenged the studio's direction and allegedly had disagreements over how Wayne's personal image was used after his death. Another, Marissa, had quietly disappeared from public view not long after the funeral. But Wayne also had close aides, a personal driver, a longtime assistant, a private nurse during his final months. None of them were named in the main will, but if these clauses were written with someone specific in mind, they were hiding in the margins, not the headlines. And then came the handwritten page. It was loose, folded in thirds, tucked between the typed sheets. Different paper, different ink. But the handwriting was unmistakably Wayne's, broad, upright, and deliberate. At the top was a single sentence. To the one who stayed silent but loyal. This is for you. Below it was a name. It didn't match any family member, not an attorney, not a business partner. It was a name that, up to this point, had never been connected publicly to John Wayne in any meaningful way. But in this moment, under oath, under scrutiny, and decades too late, it was about to take center stage. And when investigators ran the name through historical databases, one link appeared. Not in film, not in finance, but in property transfers, quietly executed in 1982. No one saw it coming, because this wasn't a person from his Hollywood life. This was someone from the shadows of his personal one. And if their connection was real, it meant Wayne had kept a secret so deeply buried, even death hadn't revealed it. Until now. Down in the basement, where the air turned thick and the concrete walls held the cold like a vault, the estate team uncovered a room no one expected. It wasn't listed on blueprints. It wasn't mentioned in the inventory logs from 1980. But tucked behind a sliding shelf of wine bottles was a narrow passage, just wide enough for one person, with bare bulbs strung along the ceiling like a forgotten tunnel. At the end was a steel door, not locked, just heavy, and behind it, a treasure trove of John Wayne's private past. This was no movie set storage room. This wasn't where he kept props or posters. This was personal, raw, untouched. Wooden crates lined the walls. Inside them, war memorabilia from his USO tours, campaign buttons from every political ally he ever supported, and military letters from World War II soldiers, many thanking him for giving them hope through the screen while they fought for their lives overseas. Some were smudged with dirt, others with tears. A dusty map of Normandy was pinned to one wall, with notations scribbled in the margins. Several ledger books lay stacked nearby, filled with handwritten logs, not financial records, but notes, movements, meetings, code names. Then came the box labeled "Private, Do Not Remove." It was bound in leather, locked with an old brass clasp. Inside were a handful of photographs, several tied bundles of letters, and a set of tapes, reel to reel, each labeled with dates but no descriptions. But the real story started with the letters. Dozens of them. Most were unsigned, written in delicate looping script. Some were addressed to Duke, others to John, and a few simply began, "To the man who walks between two worlds." The content wasn't casual. These were love letters, deep, vulnerable, poetic. They spoke of secrecy, of sacrifice, of a bond hidden from the public eye. Some were desperate, some angry. Others were filled with longing, as if the writer lived in exile from his real life. Who wrote them? No name ever appeared, no return address. But what was most unsettling wasn't the content. It was the fact that John Wayne had kept them, safely, deliberately. They weren't tossed in drawers or shoved in boxes. They were preserved, wrapped in silk, like they meant more to him than his medals or his awards. Alongside the letters were several diaries. The handwriting matched. Each journal covered about 6 months of his life. Inside, the entries tracked his thoughts between roles, his fears about mortality, and recurring doubts about the public image he'd built over decades. They love the cowboy. They don't know the man. Some truths would break the legend, but maybe the legend needs breaking. He didn't name names. He didn't confess to crimes. But what he did was crack open the curtain behind the myth. He questioned whether he'd lived his life the way he wanted, or just the way everyone expected him to. And then there was the red leather journal, worn at the edges, its strap cracked. It sat alone in a small wooden box with a note taped to the lid. If you're reading this, it means I never said it out loud. Inside, the final entry was dated June 10th, 1979, just 3 days before he died. It wasn't a letter, it wasn't a list, it was a confession. A few pages that would reframe everything people thought they knew about John Wayne. Not just the actor, but the man. He didn't want to be remembered for what he played. He wanted to be remembered for what he never said. And what was written in that journal was never meant to be made public. until now. The story may have started in the 1970s, but its unraveling came down to something far more modern: data. Following the reopening of John Wayne's estate in early 2025, a private security firm was contracted to monitor the property. The estate had grown into a tourist curiosity, and rumors of missing documents, hidden rooms, and fraudulent transfers had drawn enough attention to merit 24-hour surveillance. What they didn't expect to find, however, was that someone had already beaten them to it. As workers installed new cameras throughout the Newport Beach mansion, tiny, motion-triggered devices tucked into chandeliers and inside vent grills, they discovered another layer of equipment, smaller, older, wired deep behind panels and beams, the kind used for private monitoring, the kind someone installed without permission. And they were live. Timestamps on the footage showed recording activity had begun just weeks before the court's approval to re-enter the estate. Someone had known, before it was official, that the property would be reopened. They had prepared, and they were watching. The tapes captured late-night activity. A woman in her mid-50s, later identified as a former caretaker with ties to the Wayne Family Foundation, was seen entering through a side door with a spare key. She walked through the house like she belonged there, confident, quick. She opened drawers, pulled loose floorboards. In one clip, she stood for almost 3 minutes in front of the hidden safe that would later hold the mysterious codicil. But she never opened it, just stared. Investigators began digging into her background and found that her connection to the estate had quietly resumed in mid-2024. She had petitioned to assist with archiving historical materials and was granted limited access, but her presence was never logged after hours. No permission, no explanation. Then came the phone records. Over a 2-month period before the discovery of the codicil, she had made numerous calls to a now-retired estate attorney, one who'd previously handled probate issues for the Wayne family in the 1980s. Voicemail logs were pulled. The tone was cautious, vague. She referenced documents still left behind and asked whether anything outside the original probate could be introduced without triggering a challenge. Her call history overlapped with another disturbing trend. John Wayne Enterprises, the entity that oversees the Duke's licensing and branding rights, had flagged a series of irregular bank activities in late 2024, mostly small transfers, but one in particular stood out: a 6-figure deposit into a private account registered under a shell company in Wyoming. It came from a dormant LLC tied to one of Wayne's former publishing projects. The problem? That LLC had been dissolved in 1991. On paper, it no longer existed, but someone had revived it. Tracing the account led to a legal trust, newly established in 2024. Its listed beneficiary, a foundation named after a fictional character Wayne had played only once, and its administrator, the same woman caught on camera in the house. Now the digital trail was undeniable. The pattern showed premeditation, access, financial movement, legal consultation. She hadn't just stumbled into a box of secrets, she'd been planning around them. Still, the biggest question loomed over the entire investigation. Was she working alone? A review of email servers tied to the John Wayne Foundation uncovered something buried in metadata: a forwarding address, a digital alias, and a shared login session that took place during a meeting between Wayne's youngest son and a private archivist hired just months earlier. The puzzle pieces began falling fast. Because if this wasn't just one person, if it was more, it meant someone had kept the game going for over 40 years. And the next piece of the trail didn't point to California or even the United States. It pointed overseas, to an address in Zurich, and someone no one had suspected, until now. When the news broke that a hidden codicil had been discovered in John Wayne's estate, decades after his death, the courtroom didn't just fill with lawyers, it filled with ghosts. Old arguments, unspoken resentments, and buried rivalries were pulled into the light, and now the Wayne family was at the center of a legal storm that no one saw coming. It began with a formal petition. Wayne's oldest children, Michael and Asa, filed a motion to block the codicil from being admitted as legitimate. Their claim: undue influence, mental incapacity, and potential fraud. Michael, who had once managed much of the Duke's business affairs, argued that by May 1979, his father was too weak and medicated to write anything coherent, much less alter the terms of a will already processed by a team of attorneys. He pointed to Wayne's battle with stomach cancer, the high-dose painkillers he was prescribed, and his recurring hospitalizations. "This was a man who built America's greatest cowboy," Michael said in court. But in those last weeks, he wasn't riding tall. He was in a hospital bed, barely speaking. Someone else wrote that page, or convinced him to. On the other side stood Wayne's youngest son, Ethan, joined by a surprise faction of private historians and preservationists who supported the codicil. Their argument was precise: that the handwriting, ink, and fingerprints had already passed independent verification. The codicil might have been tucked away, but that didn't make it false. If anything, Ethan's lawyer argued, its secrecy was the most John Wayne thing of all. He didn't broadcast his personal life. He left what mattered to him in writing. And now, 40 years later, that truth deserves to be honored. But the deeper issue was one of legality. Even if Wayne had written the codicil himself, could it be honored without witnesses? Did it hold any weight when it had never been filed through probate? The legal waters were murky. California law had changed in the decades since 1979, and the court now had to decide whether to apply the laws of Wayne's time or the standards of today. The courtroom drama played out like a film script. Attorneys presented expert testimony. A forensic linguist took the stand, comparing Wayne's journal entries with the codicil's phrasing, noting that several lines in the codicil mirrored those in his private writings. "That's not coincidence," she said. "That's habit." Meanwhile, the public was stunned. Headlines rolled out across networks. The Duke's final words spark legal firestorm. Family war erupts over John Wayne's hidden will. Who really deserves the Duke's fortune? Fans chimed in across social media, split between those who believed in honoring the original 1979 will and those who saw the codicil as a deeper, more intimate piece of Wayne's real legacy. Outside the courtroom, Pilar Wayne, his third wife, who had been left out of both the original will and the codicil, released a statement to the press. "I loved John with all I had. I stood beside him until the very end. I won't question his choices, but I will say, if secrets were kept, it wasn't just from the public." Tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point when a financial investigator presented records tracing several estate assets moved quietly in the early 1980s. Transfers that lined up precisely with the timelines laid out in the codicil. Documents, wire transfers, bank authorizations. Someone had acted on instructions long thought to be non-existent. The judge called for a recess. The room emptied. Cameras rolled. Reporters whispered. That's when word broke of a new motion being filed. One name appeared on the document: Rebecca McCain, a former live-in nurse who cared for John Wayne during his final weeks. For decades, she'd stayed silent. She had moved to Oregon in the early 80s, changed her last name, and never spoke publicly about her time with the Duke. Until now. She had agreed to testify. What she claimed to know, according to her legal team, would not only support the codicil's authenticity, but reveal exactly why it had been hidden. The courtroom was set to reconvene the following morning. And as the gavel came down to close the day's proceedings, one thing was clear. The Duke's final ride wasn't over. Not yet. When all the documents were finally laid out, wills, codicils, ledgers, letters, even the handwritten journal, the estate team did what medical examiners do after a mysterious death. They performed an autopsy, not of a body, but of a legacy. Every word, clause, and omission was dissected by legal scholars, estate planners, biographers, and psychologists alike, all trying to answer the same question. What was John Wayne trying to say? And when did he start planning to say it? The codicil wasn't a standalone note scrawled in pain. It matched, almost line for line, with several themes found in Wayne's private journals, written before his cancer diagnosis. Phrases like, "Family loyalty isn't always blood," and "Let the ones who stayed in the storm hold the flag," showed up repeatedly, months, sometimes years, before he ever knew he was dying. Experts took that as a sign. This wasn't a rushed decision in the fog of medication. It was something he'd been wrestling with privately, long before his body began to fail. The estate's legal analysts were divided. Some argued that the codicil's format, handwritten and unwitnessed, meant it would never stand in court, regardless of intention. Others said the legal weight didn't matter, the moral weight did. He didn't need the court's permission to tell the truth, one expert said on a live news segment. He needed time, and for reasons only he understood, he waited until the very end to put it in writing. But beyond the legal implications, the larger conversation turned to legacy. Should a man's public image outweigh his private truths? Should loyalty be rewarded when it's silent, or punished because it wasn't loud enough to be seen? These were the questions now haunting the Wayne family. Some felt betrayed by the hidden directives. Others saw them as a long overdue correction. After all, Wayne's Hollywood persona had always been larger than life, rugged, principled, unbreakable. But the man behind the camera, he was complicated, flawed, thoughtful, and perhaps in his final months, desperate to control the one thing he never could while alive, how he'd be remembered when he was gone. Financial experts analyzed the movement of assets tied to the offshore clause. It appeared some of the transfers had been made legally, but without disclosure to the main estate. Others remained unverifiable. Paintings allegedly gifted to a museum had vanished. Film reels mentioned in one footnote were never found. The trail felt deliberate. Either Wayne had scattered parts of his legacy on purpose, or someone had helped him do it. But as more of the codicil was read aloud in court, something unusual emerged. Tucked into the final paragraph of the last page was a single clause that hadn't been referenced in any of the surrounding material. It was short, plain, and buried so deep in legal jargon that even the estate attorneys missed it on the first read. In the event that no direct descendant claims these possessions within 45 years of my death, full authority transfers to the custodian of my journal, who alone carries the burden of my intent. The courtroom went quiet when it was read aloud. 45 years. That number wasn't random. It had been exactly 46 years since John Wayne's passing. And now, a single clause threatened to override everything. Because someone had the journal. Someone had come forward. And that person wasn't part of the Wayne bloodline. All eyes turned to the back of the courtroom, where Rebecca McCain, the former nurse, the silent witness, sat with a locked briefcase on her lap. The claws had triggered something no one predicted. A shift in ownership, in history, in truth. Because now, by Wayne's own hand, the last word didn't belong to his family. It belonged to the one person who had stayed quiet the longest. The courtroom lights may have dimmed for the day, but nothing about John Wayne's legacy feels settled. Not anymore. The discovery of the hidden codicil, the sealed safe, the love letters, and that single explosive clause buried in legal jargon have done more than just stir up old memories. They've cracked the foundation of a carefully preserved image. Now the world sees more than one John Wayne. There's the man who starred in The Searchers, True Grit, and The Alamo, the symbol of rugged independence, the American icon. And then there's the man who left a handwritten note, hidden behind velvet, trusting someone outside his family to carry his final message. Two wills now stand in quiet opposition. One, public, notarized, and processed through official probate in 1979. The other, handwritten, intimate, and now backed by fingerprints, psychological profiles, and the whispers of legal weight. Courts may argue for months, even years, about which version of John Wayne's voice holds the greater truth, and the fight is far from over. Will Pilar Wayne, still alive and now more outspoken than ever, mount a renewed challenge to reclaim what she believes she was unjustly denied? Will Wayne's children continue their internal legal war, or reach an uneasy truce to protect their father's image from further erosion? And what about the items themselves? The Remington paintings, the lost footage, the journal entries, and love letters. Will these become the property of historians, museums, or private collectors? Or will they vanish again, this time behind the guarded vaults of silence and control? Perhaps the most unsettling question is this: how much more is still out there? Because if one hidden safe held this much power, what might still remain, buried, sealed, waiting? There's talk of reopening Wayne's archives, more forensic dives. A legal request has already been submitted to trace the offshore accounts listed in the codicil. And as the court decides how much weight to give to the clause about the journal's custodian, one thing is clear: this isn't the end. It's barely the beginning. And the public? They're watching closely. Fans who grew up with the Duke now find themselves caught between admiration and curiosity, between honoring a myth and understanding a man. For decades, people thought they knew him. But this case has proven something no film ever could. John Wayne was still writing his story, long after the cameras stopped rolling. Now, it's your turn. What do you believe really happened behind those locked doors? Who deserved to inherit the truth? And if this is what we found, after 45 years, what's still waiting to be uncovered? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more unravelings like this, and share this video with anyone who still believes every cowboy rides off into the sunset without leaving secrets behind. Because the Duke may be gone, but his secrets are only beginning to surface.